today have a very special session. Like today we have the first session of our new series of webinar that is called Strengthening Communities for the Future We Want, Urban-Rural Linkages, Policy, Legislation, and Governance. And this webinar is also taking place as part of the Terra Madre 2020 Worldwide Slow Food Festival. As you just saw in the video, but also is part of the UN Habitat Urban October. So we have these two events, celebrations, commemorations, if you want to call it like that, that help us to remind that we need to keep improving and making our cities, but also rural communities more equitable and sustainable. And for this, it is very important to transform the relations between urban and rural areas. And that means that it's also necessary to support the network of actors that tie urban and rural realities, and also the spaces where these actors meet. And therefore, today we're having this special webinar on market cities to start our new webinar series. So having said that, I would like to give the floor to Richard McCarthy, who is going to be chairing this meeting. And I wish us all a very fruitful webinar. And yeah, enjoy. Just want to, before Richard you're talking, I'm going just to remind some of the, let's say, usual common rules during Zoom meetings. Please make sure that your microphones are muted. Also, we have activated the chat box. So please post your messages, comments, remarks, and questions to our speakers and to our discussants. And we will be posting also in the chat box useful material to keep this conversation more interesting and fruitful for all. So Richard, yeah, please go ahead.
Camila, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard McCarthy. I am a member of the Executive Committee for Slow Food International and a longtime public market veteran, practitioner, and I'm very excited about this partnership to share what is one of the most intriguing food gatherings on the planet, Terra Madre. This year, it is now in a whole nother sense global and digital, and has provided us an opportunity to collaborate with UN Habitat, which really excites us because within the food movement, of course, we see that there is an extraordinary proximity between food and territories and cities, practitioners and policymakers that converge, in particular in public markets. And that is what we will be exploring this next 90 minutes. Having attended some of these other UN Habitat seminars, I was absolutely intrigued with what Camila described, how vibrant the chat is. And by all means, do populate the chat. And do know that this is streaming via Slow Food on the YouTube channels.
No problem, you're good.
And and via social media. If you want to comment, the hashtag Market Cities is one that we encourage you to use so that we can get this conversation as far and wide as we can. What is exciting, what we'll be doing for the first half of the presentation, we've got an extraordinary set of speakers who I'll introduce to you as we carry through. And Market Cities represents a collaborative between several veteran organizations who approach public markets from different standpoints of whether it's public health or public space animation or biodiversity and economic development, between Slow Food International, Project for Public Spaces, and the HealthBridge Foundation. and we will shed some light from beneath the canopy of the markets from around the world, who are navigating certainly very difficult terrain right now in the COVID-19 era. First of all, public markets are extraordinary ancient mechanisms that throughout the world are often overlooked as vestiges of the past, or institutions that are tolerated rather than invested in. But what we see is in this public assembly, recurring public assembly of independent vendors who literally stand behind the fruits of their labor and market it directly to the general public, that there is an incredible opportunity in public markets to achieve a public good, and a public good that finds its ground in cities, which is why we term this opportunity of market cities, but that these markets can become incredible meeting places that unite territories around food, around shared goals, and enable to achieve extraordinary number of capital impacts, whether it is the financial capital you see inside the market, in the informality of the market, the capital impacts, financial capital impacts surrounding the market, and therefore woven into urban planning strategies, as well as the health of the community, the ecological impact, and I think most importantly, something about the ancient mechanism of these markets speaks to maybe how we are wired as peoples, which is maybe one reason why these institutions have remained so resilient, despite the fact that we have tended to do our best to try and demolish them, is that they are resilient expressions of civic engagement. They almost emulate the social contract, which we see really beginning to find voice in markets between urban and rural, and to begin to reformulate what it might mean to reinvent what was once a national import substitution strategy into something that looks more like a regional or municipal one. So it's this wonderful juxtaposition between national agricultural policies and climate issues, and what role cities can play and what role markets can play in the cities to elevate civil society, the informal economy, and the expressions of community good. And what we're excited to share today is that the work of a number of practitioners, longtime practitioners in public markets in the global north and in the global south, have recognized and identified key indicators of places that are elevating the role of public markets as conveners. So to look far beyond just the tents and umbrellas of the markets, but that the markets can begin to integrate some of the high-level policy work with some of the low-level work on the ground. And we think that we've found a key to some what could be further future investment in markets, especially because we see such nimble response during COVID in the markets. These are challenging times, but they're also timely. The way the conversations about sustainable agriculture are being elevated within the UN discourse next year with the Global Summit on Sustainable Agriculture, with the way that cities are being elevated as key drivers in the climate discourse. So today what we'll be doing is first setting the stage of what is thought and meant to be the market cities approach. And then we'll begin to look at some of the nonlinear openings that practitioners have found around the world, and then we'll bring it back to an open discussion. If you have questions during the sessions, by all means, run them through the chat, and hopefully we will have time for discussion as we carry through this 90 minutes. To begin with, I'd like to introduce to you Kelly Verel, who is the Senior Director of Programs and Projects at the Project for Public Spaces here in the US. and the Project for Public Spaces have been really important field builders for public markets, and are our convening host of the Market Cities initiative. And Kelly, if I can turn it over to you, you can begin to share your screen and walk us through what is meant by the Market Cities approach.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
Seamless, seamless.
Is that working?
It's working great.
Okay, great. Good morning. It's morning where I am. Thank you all for being with us this morning. And thank you to Slow Food and UN Habitat for hosting this event. We're really pleased to be here this morning. So I am going to kick it off with a bit of background on the Market Cities Initiative, some the guiding principles that we're using as we do this work moving forward. So the innovative practices that we're seeing supporting markets emerging are coming out of a diverse range of cities, from Lima to Seattle to Hanoi. Cities such as London and Barcelona, the two most recent hosts of our last two International Public Markets Conferences, have adopted holistic market city strategies to offer new models that other markets can learn from. The Market Cities Initiative partners have identified the following 7 key principles based on our understanding of these and other innovative public market practices. Okay, give me one. Go. Principle number 1, a market city includes a wide variety of types of markets in a city as part of one market system. Types of markets include everything from a central wholesale market to food and non-food markets, such as flea markets and craft markets, as well as informal markets or clusters of street vendors. Principle 2, a market city organizes a diverse coalition of partners and stakeholders who can collaborate and take action together to achieve common policy objectives. Market cities require participation from market operators and managers, local community organizers, and city and regional government agencies, to name a few. Principle 3, a market city measures the value of its markets to understand how they function. This includes understanding the supply chains for public markets, the quality of the market's physical facilities and public spaces, the economic, social, and public health impacts of markets, and the needs and wants of customers and vendors. Principle 4, a market city has distribution networks that prioritize and support healthy, affordable, and safe food and other goods produced in the region. These networks provide the physical facilities necessary for storage, processing, and distribution, as well as the organizational capacity to connect urban and rural. Principle 5, a market city regularly invests in its market facilities and the management skills of market operators. Potential investments include renovating existing markets, building new markets as needed to meet demand or address operational limitations, and ensuring that market managers have the skills and staff to operate the market efficiently, effectively, and resiliently. Principle 6, a market city helps diverse types of vendors start and grow their businesses. Types of assistance include helping vendors, especially from disadvantaged groups, start a new business, innovate, or expand an existing one with new services and products, providing vendors with equipment, services, and training they need to follow modern food safety practices, and providing training and technical help to improve sales. And finally, Principle 7, a market city recognizes that its markets are also public spaces that welcome different kinds of people and maintain important cultural heritage. They support the role of public markets by creating public gathering places and markets that encourage social mixing, investing in design and physical infrastructure in public spaces around the market or within the market district so that they're safe, accessible, and attractive, and programming special cultural events and activities, especially those around healthy diets and safe food. Project for Public Spaces actually just recently wrapped up a pilot project to kind of flex these 7 principles, so to speak, to see what it would look like to support an emerging market city strategy in North America. And the 3 cities that we worked with were Pittsburgh, Seattle, and Toronto. The report is complete and available for download on our website. You can see the link there is at pps.org/market cities, and we'll put that in the chat as well. We're really excited about this report. If you want to have a better kind of deep dive understanding into market cities in North America, the report brings together new data and analysis, as well as strategic recommendations and actions that public market systems can take to work toward achieving those 7 market city principles. And finally, we just hope that this webinar, this report, this partnership with HealthBridge Foundation of Canada and Slow Food International is really just the beginning of our engagement in this work with many cities and communities around the world. So with that, I'll hand it back to Richard. Thank you so much.
Kelly, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for, I think, walking us through what, I guess, 2 points that really come to mind is, for one, the balance, the precarious balance between commerce and community in these public spaces is something that's often missed, except for those who participate in it, in the markets, and that these 7 principles, these indicators, are not a template. They're not a linear path. You must do 1, then 2, then 3, but there are these elements that we see present where markets are really flourishing, and we think that they are underutilized and they could be better utilized. And the experience in North America during COVID, which was also so fascinating that this report covers some of the trickier moments during the assessment of public markets, is how do markets manage the lockdown. And the agility that I think the report covers really sheds light on the ecosystem of markets, whereas so much of the work the last 25 years has been how to support the market rather than the markets, and that really elevates it to a whole nother level. Well, to see what this looks like on the ground, I'd like to introduce you to Kristie Daniel, who's the program director of the Livable Cities program for the HealthBridge Foundation. Though based in Canada, HealthBridge works all over the world and is a public health entity that sees this linkage between public health, public spaces, and economic development, especially in places where the weak social safety net points to the importance of markets as being the social safety net, as the System D, the informal economy, is for many places. And I know that you've got, Kristie, a whirlwind tour for us that you'd like to get started. So if I could introduce you and get you going, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you. So this was the part that gave me nightmares last night. Can you see that, Richard?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So as Richard said, my name is Kristie Daniel, and I'm the director of the Livable Cities program at HealthBridge. At HealthBridge, we work with partners worldwide to improve health and health equity through research, policy, and action. What we really wanted to do today was to show you some great examples of the 7 principles. So we're going to take you on a trip around the world and show you videos from our partners of some of the work that they've been working on in markets. So our first example is coming to us from the Mafra Foundation in Ghana.
My name is Namata Serumaga Musasi, and I'm a design consultant with Mafra Foundation in Accra, Ghana. In 2018, Mafra Foundation collaborated with 2 local market communities in a project funded by UN Habitat and the Block by Block Foundation. The aim of this project was to add micro play spaces to the 2 markets. Markets in Accra tend to be dominated by women. From the vendors to the porters to the market queens who run the operations of the market, most people you meet in a market will be women. Many of these women have children. Market infrastructure does not always adequately accommodate the people in the market, especially not the children. Through a series of workshops and conversations with the communities in the market, we were able to explore the various options or visions for what a market that accommodated children would look like. One thing that was very interesting was how quickly the children started to use the spaces even as we were still constructing them. All in all, I would say the biggest lesson we learned out of this project is the importance of enabling the community to define and take ownership of a project that they are going to inhabit.
So the Accra example is a great example of principle number 7, which looks at public spaces. But I also think this is an interesting example of principle number 6, which is really focused on helping vendors. Providing supports for female vendors is critical for their success. And for women, the support they often need is help with their children. So in this example, Mafra supported the vendors through ensuring a safe and fun environment for their children, and that will indirectly help the women in their overall businesses. So our next example comes from the Toronto Food Policy Council.
Scarborough Farmers Market. Thank you for joining us. And we thank you, Scarborough residents, for your support.
Because you want to eat. Imports $20 billion of food, and 50% of that could be produced locally. And people constantly keep on saying local food is too expensive. Farmers markets have grown, but there's still a disconnect between that idea of supporting local food and really committing to local food. We need a lot more people in our city saying yes to entrepreneurs and saying yes to have food in every neighborhood, and yes to have more conversations with our farmers and our food producers.
So the Toronto example gave us an example of principle number 4 and looking at food systems and urban and rural linkages. And although there's more work to be done, Toronto has a green belt that surrounds the city, which is approximately 2 million acres of protected land. Farmland around Toronto has been under threat as approximately 100,000 new immigrants to Canada arrive to the Greater Toronto region each year, and that creates a massive demand for land. So the Greenbelt was created in part to prevent further loss of farmland. Markets support almost 3,000 small and medium-sized businesses across Toronto and the livelihoods of local farmers. And the local markets play that critical role in providing access to local, fresh, high-quality produce to tens of thousands of urban residents. And so it's an important example of urban and rural linkages. So the next example comes from HealthBridge's Livable Cities program in Vietnam.
My name is Han. I'm project manager for Livable Cities. I'm coming to you from Hansa Market in the center of the Hanoi city. At one time, this was a thriving market full of life and energy. But in 2011, the city government introduced a policy that would shut down all markets and replace it with shopping centers. I'd like to show you what this market looks like now. There's no life here. Vendors find it difficult to sell and customers don't want to come here. Instead, many of the vendors have moved out to the street, and this is where customers would like to shopping. But for now, street markets are mostly illegal, and these vendors are not considered informal, and therefore their livelihood is always at risk. But saving the markets isn't enough. This is Châu Long Market. It's an important market for the city and for this neighborhood. It's a place full of people, but as you can see, it needs renovations. We work with Steve, who is co-founder of PPS, to organize a design workshop with Hanoi Architects Association, and teams of young architects came up with some great design concepts for 3 different markets. As a result of that competition, the national government became more interested in markets, and we are now working with them to develop national policy that will protect and preserve markets into the future.
So the Hanoi example highlights the need for policy at both the local and the national level. The city currently has a variety of market types, which addresses principle number 1, but not all types of markets are formally recognized. And in order to save the markets, HealthBridge Vietnam organized a campaign, which is an example of principle number 2, as it involved a wide variety of stakeholders in the city, including the Women's Union. And they helped organize a month-long exhibition on markets. Now that the national government is interested in developing a national policy with stakeholders, that will have far-reaching implications for looking at markets as an integrated system throughout cities in Vietnam. Our next example comes from Barcelona city government. So Barcelona is an amazing example of principle number 5 and a city government regularly investing in their markets. They have a thriving network of 43 permanent public markets that serve 73 neighborhoods. And from 2011 to 2015, Barcelona invested 133 million euros in market renovations, and 25 of the city's markets have undergone major restoration. 8,000 vendors work at over 40 public markets throughout the city, supporting 65 million visitors a year and a 1 billion euro turnover. So it's clear that public markets are a substantial economic driver in Barcelona and the surrounding region of Catalonia. So our last video comes to you from our partner Urban Planning for Community Change.
Hi, this is Verel, Executive Director of Urban Planning for Community Change. I'm coming to you from Kilombero Market. In 2018-2019, we conducted a study on the market. We found many things, but one of the most important was the inequitable spatial distribution of market. This was confirmed in our survey with the customers who told us they had to travel over 25 minutes by Daladala to reach a market. During COVID-19, this lack of spatial equity is even more problematic. We want and need people to stay close to home, but people also need access to food.
We have only just started working on this issue, but we believe the game will provide an opportunity to fix this spatial inequality, especially in the short term. The Genge are small informal kiosks located in neighborhoods, often by bus stops. They typically purchase their food from the market. Some of the things we are looking at include better supporting these informal vendors through training, broadening the product they sell, and better connecting them directly to local farmers. Thank you.
So this example from Arusha really demonstrates the need to understand your market system. No one had previously looked at markets in Arusha, and so although people would realize that they have to travel far to reach a market, seeing the map which visually depicts the inequitable distribution, really brought that message home. But the Tanzanian story also highlights the need to focus on principle number 1. The Genge have the potential to serve the community much better than they are now. And if we work on principle number 6, which is helping vendors grow their business, and principle number 4, by better linking these Genge directly to the farmers, we'll be well on our way to supporting Arusha to becoming a market city. So we believe that it's important for cities and stakeholders to really understand their market landscape. And to help with that, the Market Cities Initiative has organized a webinar where we will be sharing methods and tools for mapping markets. So please consider joining us on December 1st. You can sign up at the link that's on the page, and I believe that Kurt is going to be copying it into the chat box as well so that you can copy it from there. So thank you very much.
Kristie, thank you so much. Thank you for demonstrating that there are so many different points of entry. There's not just one avenue. And I suspect that our next speaker, Cecilia Andersson, who's with the Global Public Space Program at UN Habitat, is extremely familiar with the multiple points of entry that come with this kind of public space intervention that links people, places, and products. So Cecilia, welcome, and over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Super. Let me just, I'm sort of a little bit challenged with the technology, but I will start from the beginning. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening as it is in Nairobi. And I'm really, really happy to be able to join this webinar on market cities. And actually last night I was doing quite a bit of reading about markets and the history of markets. And it's really amazing how markets are actually so ancient. And I think you talked about that, Richard, how ancient they are. And, you know, it was a way of actually providing goods and services to the surrounding locality. And how we, as we became more urbanized and as we were introduced to the cash-based economy, how market towns actually started to increase. And they were often located where there was good transport or good connections to transport, for example, crossroads or rivers and similar. So, and historically how the markets were often open air. But as we urbanized, this changed, and larger cities had higher demands on products coming into the markets. And with the increase of trade on a regional and international scale, this changed how our local markets actually looked. And with the rise of import and export and a broad range of goods, it contributed to moving away from actually the reliance on local produce. And we also saw permanent shops popping up as well, which were a more reliable source and providing stable trading hours in comparison to the markets, which were often periodic. And but I think we actually really need to look at the benefits of those marketplaces. And they're numerous, and I'm not going to go into them, but you know, we're talking about employment, encouraging local businesses, local production, promoting urban regeneration as hubs of services, boosting the local economy, building social capital, and bridging the urban-rural divide through trade and economic flows. And Kristie actually talked about this, how important markets are for local economic development. And Kelly also touched upon this, on how important it is, both on the neighborhood level, where you can see that local markets have an impact on both directly, but indirectly. So indirectly with that it actually creates a lot of activity, but directly in that people were earning a living, that local government actually could also earn a fee from the market stalls that the vendors were renting. And this actually provided this now economic cycle on the local level. but I think it's also really important to actually bring out that on the neighborhood level, especially in the global south, we're seeing how important it is to have those mixed or multi-purpose market spaces. And I think the example from Tanzania was also showing that you know, a car park can actually become a market during the weekend when it's not being used as a car park. And so it actually relies on local governments being quite creative and actually identifying those spaces, and also actually adopting legislation to be able to allow that to happen. And I think also Kelly talked about this, about how sort of small street markets can occupy spaces. And we're talking about in the global south that about 60% of the population rely on informal work. And a lot of that informal work is actually around trade and vending on the streets. So, you know, it's also about local governments being very creative in sort of linking that formal and informal economies and providing that space for traders. And now with the COVID-19, we've actually seen how many of the markets have been struggling to be able to then accommodate and adapt to the situation. And we were approached by the mayor of Banjul in Gambia, where she was actually struggling with how can I actually ensure that my market spaces can be open, but still ensure that people are safe. So making sure that people are physical distancing, that the vendors are safe, but also the general public from virus infections, and promoting good hygiene. So we supported the mayor of Banjul in trying to come up with a plan for how she could do that. And part of it was around tactical urbanism and meanwhile planning. So using, trying to rework how the space is used around the market on the streets, for example, that market spaces could be allocated to street vendors, so you're decongesting the market. We also actually looked at the design approach, the design of the marketplace, and ensuring that that could be designed differently to ensure physical distancing, but also introducing materials that are more easier to clean and disinfect. We also looked at partnerships and how important that was to work together with the market leaders and the vendors to come up with a strategy that would actually suit them the best. And that area-based approach. So using those design interventions to rethink, you know, how can we actually share public space and public facilities and create more room, but also actually letting the market spill out over into the streets. And we also identified some open spaces close to the market that street vendors could also move to. And I really love these 7 principles which Kelly just ran through earlier, and I think it's really important when we're looking at, you know, the role of local government, and a lot of local governments they know where the marketplaces are, but they're not always sure how the marketplaces function, who works in those markets, how are they managed. So it's really important, as Kristie was saying as well, to understand where we are to know where to go. And so we supported the county government of Kisumu to map their city markets as well. So looking at the management of those markets, whether it's managed by the local government or managed by an association or jointly managed. We also looked at where produce was sourced, if it came from close by or from far away. And we also looked at which markets are informal, formal, safety, accessibility. We looked at the spatial or the distribution across the county and across the city, and how inclusive and safe those markets are and how accessible they are to the people that are there. We also worked with our colleagues in a different unit on mapping markets in the West Nile region. So looking more on a regional level, so from 3 municipalities, and how those what markets there were and how those markets actually connect with each other. And the importance here was also the focus on social inclusion and social cohesion, because we're also looking at the internally displaced people and how, you know, we can actually use markets as a way of building that social cohesion between host communities and internally displaced communities, and using the marketplace as a space for that. So here in the West Nile region, we were also looking how far people actually travel to be able to sell their goods in the market. And so people actually traveled from about 10 kilometers. The majority actually traveled from about more than 10 kilometers to be able to sell their goods in the market. We also looked at how those markets were managed and the constellation of the management groups. And Kristie actually talked about this a lot, about the importance of having a citywide market strategy. And I'm not going to talk about Barcelona, but I just wanted to highlight the importance of being able to develop a strategy so that local governments can actually set those standards for the quality of those markets, making sure that they're equally distributed, which they were talking about in Tanzania, in Arusha, to make sure that there's an equal distribution and all neighborhoods have access to markets. And now in a COVID situation, we see how important that is. It's about bringing forward and developing an action plan, being able to understand where resources need to be put to be able to manage this network of markets. It's about engaging the local communities in their immediate environment and enabling and empowering them to manage those market spaces and developing those partnerships. So I also want to say that it's really important, like was shown in Uganda, that we need to also take into consideration not only the citywide, but the region. And we need to tap into some of those opportunities to foster these market systems through regional planning. We need to look at those social and spatial disparities. We need to look at the regional economies, and if we look at it from a regional scale, how we can actually create those economies of scale and agglomeration. And we need to actually support with those strategies and policies to be able to contribute to this system and network of markets which we were talking about. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much and pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. My goodness, there are two concepts that jumped out of my mouth as soon as you started talking about them. One is governance. I know that as a longtime practitioner of running farmers markets in New Orleans, I would get hammered as an urban advocate, dweller, market developer, of why did I care about rural issues? And similarly, I'd go into rural meetings and they're like, why are you here? And I think what may help us climb out of that territorial governance question, regionalism, is what ran through all of your slides, is the issue of imagination. We need to reimagine the markets as playing a different kind of role and help elevate them as not just these things that exist, but mechanisms that are strategic, and we can leverage that region because people can touch them. They touch them through the biodiversity inside the markets and with the accents and the voices that are heard. When it comes to the accents and in particular the tones of the voices, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, John Taylor, who is the Chief Technical Advisor for FAO Bangladesh, and in particular is working on the Dhaka Food Project and the markets in Dhaka. I have the absolute joy to work with John on the markets in Dhaka, especially in the post-COVID era, where we really got to see the markets tested and we're able to identify where is their leadership in these sort of long underfunded wet markets, where are the opportunities to bring them outdoors, to bring them to the scale of neighborhoods, and also begin to challenge some of the issues that Kristie raised with Ghana. I mean, how different, though the markets have the same structure and concept throughout the planet, the nature, the cultural nature of the markets do reflect their places. So in Ghana, if the vendors are largely women and there are queens of the market who run it, certainly in Dhaka, it is a man's world. It is mostly men who are vendors. and who are shoppers, which does raise questions of social cohesion. How can we make them more welcoming? All these issues really come to the fore during this compressed period of COVID. And I'm really excited to welcome John here, and John, to give you the floor and to take over our screens with your story, your images, and your insights.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everybody for joining. My name is John Taylor, and I work in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I am the Chief Technical Advisor for a project called the Dhaka Food System Project, and our project wasn't initially focused really on specifically on markets themselves, but we obviously saw the great opportunity and importance of markets play in this city, a city of, let's say, around 20 million people, if you think about the greater Dhaka. And a study that FAO had done in 2018 revealed that, you know, despite the growth in popularity of supermarkets, over 84% of households still use wet markets. So we saw that this is obviously a very important, you know, area for the city. I'm going to present some slides here. So the project started maybe a year ago, and I think the COVID really kind of reshaped or refocused a lot of what we were doing. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about how COVID has had an impact, what happened over the course of the last few months, and how that's helping to indicate some of the opportunities or issues that we are now sort of more or focusing on working with stakeholders and the government to address. So obviously, as I said, this is a huge city. Food is a very important part of not only people's everyday, you know, eating and sustenance, but also livelihoods. So when COVID hit, you know, we thought, well, this is a very important thing to understand. So over the course of, say, the last, from say March until May or June, what we were doing was, through our contacts with different market associations, we were trying to understand, well, what was happening and how were food prices fluctuating, what was the scene inside markets. And so we were producing these situation reports. There were 7 of them that were made. They came out every 2 or 3 weeks. And basically we were trying to provide some information for you know, stakeholders, government, people who were interested in what's kind of things were happening in the markets. We picked 10 markets that we had some, you know, previous contact with, and we were calling them and just sort of understanding what it was, and then we would create these reports and share them. I think it was just very important for government, policymakers, other people to sort of have a sense of what was going on at that time. And one of the things that we really were seeing was that food prices were going up, and this had a very big impact on everyone, but particularly the urban poor. And you know, there were different kinds, you know, different food value chains, supply chains were disrupted, but you know, in different ways, and sort of in the 4 different cities that make up the metropolitan area, there were definitely different impacts. So you had some prices which were coming down, and other prices which were spiking, and that, you know, over the course of time that was very different. But it became very clear that the urban poor were really suffering very the most. But you know, we also have to understand that the markets employ a lot of people, and because of fears of contagion in the markets, there were much fewer customers. People were afraid of going there, and that also impacted the lives of traders, but also all of the different people who are contributing to the food supply chain, which is millions and millions of people throughout the country. And this was, you know, the markets actually stayed open. So it's almost like it bent, but it didn't break. That they suffered a loss in customer base, but they maintained open. And I think that's a very important part of the story in Dhaka, that they continued to serve the people. So I'm going to look at a few different things that sort of occurred during this period. And one of the important ones was, say, about a month after lockdown, the city government decided to move many of the wet markets outside because that people needed a social distance. They of course needed, access to the vegetables and other products, and to keep it safe for vendors and customers. And so this was something that was actually very successful. It was very kind of ad hoc measure. And you can see there's not a lot of infrastructure here. Luckily, this didn't happen during the rainy season, but there was a lot, these were very, very successful, and it kept a lot of access for a lot of people. And what we learned from this, and what became very popular as an idea we're working on now, is the importance of, how farmers markets would be a great use of these open spaces temporarily. And this is something that we're working on with the mayors and stakeholders now, is to kind of link farmers in the sort of close to the city with the city, shortening those supply chains, but having this kind of offer of farmers markets. Another thing, sorry, this is quite pixelated, but another thing that was very important was that the army stepped in. And so this was sort of a national government initiative, but the army came in and helped to buy a lot of products from farmers who were, let's say, suffering from the inability to sell or bring their products to market. They helped to transport, and they helped to organize sort of manage and administer the safety measures around some of these markets. And in some cases, they were even providing food to the very poor in a way that allowed them access. Another thing that we saw a lot of was that markets were moving, and people were moving, vendors were moving, became very popular, vendors, partly because people had lost their jobs and they were looking for other kinds of employment. Also just because there's a lot of demand to not go very far from home. And so food started to travel around the city through neighborhoods and became much more accessible. And as a result of that, we're trying to help. The government's not very well suited to supporting this kind of distribution of food. And so we're working with government and other stakeholders to understand, well, what can make this kind of food distribution safe and more available to people. But not only were there kind of informal vendors, also the government started to make their food available, or sort of, got into bringing food from fisheries from outside of the city. And we see a number of different government-led initiatives. Here's a smaller farmers market, which brings in sort of products from farmers who are working with the government to different places in the city. And this is only one example, but it gave those who use it the idea that, well, it's important that we can try to expand on this. So I think it was some of these initiatives that kind of rose in popularity because of the pandemic kind of offer some good examples. Another thing that we were looking at when we're with markets was just, the use of face masks, and were markets safer places, and we found that they were indeed not. And this was just a quick survey, but it helped us to understand that trainings were needed, and market associations had to be engaged in a form of training that could help to build understanding of the vendors, also the market association, their role to manage this, and to put a lot more information out there for those vendors and shoppers. So those are just some, I think, some examples of how the food system was very much put under a lot of pressure. Markets ended up being extremely important places to keep the food supply open. But since there was so much of a pressure on it, it revealed a lot of areas where I think policymakers, government, stakeholders want to improve, to strengthen and make more resilient, more accessible. And those are things that we're trying to address going forward. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, John. And thank you for showcasing the extraordinary echoing of something that Cecilia mentioned earlier, is this multi-use of space, and how creative markets and local, and I think interestingly enough, national government was to intervene and recognize that when at this very moment when safety is on people's minds, it becomes something that travels far beyond personal safety at a time of a pandemic, but also the safety of food and the financial safety and the economy. And we've noticed safety has become a key piece of terminology that I think provides markets an opportunity, especially since we can provide the transparency to actually observe the safety, and hence the measuring the mask wearing and the indicators of, are these places being managed with safety in mind? Well, thank you, John, and thank you for all of those presentations. We have stayed pretty close to on schedule, but we knew that there were several remarks and insights we also wanted to squeeze into the conversation. And so we have two discussants joining us, one from North America, one from South America, to provide some insights and responses to what they heard. To start off with, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Hurwitz, who is the GrowNYC GreenMarket Director in New York City in the United States. So GrowNYC is a 501c3 entity, a nonprofit entity, so an NGO that has a very close association with the mayor's office. And I think, you know, Michael, you have probably a wonderfully close, intimate, love-hate relationship with the mayor's office. But I think it sheds light on one of the questions that have come up throughout all of these markets, especially the informal markets, the ones which, like the green markets in New York City that operate out in the open, may appear informal, but have to negotiate and navigate very complex regulations and relations with city government. And when I look at the chat box, I see so many questions coming up with this concern for regulations, and how do markets join in that conversation rather than just being at the end and recipient of regulations? How can we maybe begin to shape regulations? Michael, I know that the markets were under a great deal of stress once New York City became an epicenter for COVID-19. There was a lot of effort to deem the markets as essential services, and it's been a whirlwind trip ever since. And we'd love to hear what your insights are regarding this market cities discourse, and where you see your experience once you've caught your breath come in. And Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for having me. And Cecilia, I loved your greeting, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I need to hang out with you guys more often, clearly, and looking forward to seeing everyone in person when this is all over. You know, Richard, it's funny, I've been following the comments, and that was one of the notes that I took to comment on was, I think there's a need for enabling policies for markets. And I actually think that that's a double-edged sword, in that you need to make sure it's the right body that's knowledgeable, that's making the appropriate regulations, or at least creating policies that allow them to get out of the way and let people make good decisions who know how to operate markets. You know, throughout this conversation, I've been thinking, is New York City a market city? And Richard, like you said, that there are so many entry points and ways and balances and ways to answer that question. But I will tell you that we are an independent nonprofit. We do have a relationship with the city, but we operate very independently. In fact, we've had markets that have been interrupted physically because one agency doesn't talk to another agency. But I can't say enough how important it is to have a relationship with that local authority, one where they see you as an extension of their work. For us to be deemed essential first by the governor, and then to work directly with the mayor's office. He appointed a food czar, and we would not have been able to do what we did without that relationship. We had 42 sites open at the time throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City, some larger, some smaller. And we had to reconfigure everything overnight. We had to reconfigure markets by the day. We sometimes made shifts within an hour and started taking space that wasn't on our permit. We started closing streets that we never were able to prior. We needed access to PPE to keep our staff safe, to keep our farmers safe. And they came through. And the one thing COVID has brought is people willing to experiment for the first time. We see outside, restaurants operating on it used to be $12,000 in a 2-year process. And this time it was I think a $5 or $20 registration fee. And the next thing you know, you had outdoor seating, and that's what saved restaurants during COVID. But having that relationship with the city and them just understanding they needed to get out of the way and facilitate where they could, and then invest resources and provide resources, we wouldn't have been able to keep our sites open. And now we have 82 sites that are operating throughout the 5 boroughs. In the comments and what I've heard, I actually have more questions than comments, and really look forward to following up with you to ask those questions. I think it's interesting to see in Barcelona that a supermarket is an anchor tenant of a project that is focused on medium-sized and small vendors, because in the US, I think that it's almost an us versus them mentality, and don't know that the supermarkets see themselves in that role, except for the enlightened ones. We have a market on 175th Street in the Washington Heights neighborhood. It's actually our second oldest market, and the supermarket that we operate in front of does its highest number of sales on the Thursday that we're out front, and they love the fact that we're there. So I thought that was an interesting comment to read. I don't think I have much time, but I do want to, always talk about the role of, urban-rural linkages and data collection, which is something that I saw Brian, you talked about, and the need to collect data. Well, we had a study with Cornell and Colorado State where looked at number of sales that our markets drove to rural communities, and the multiplier effect of those sales, and the social capital that was created. One of the things they looked at also was the intellectual capital, and what type of idea flow is there, and how is someone coming from the rural part of our country coming into the city, what ideas are they taking back? And what it showed is there's an incredible amount of influence in both directions. New ideas, new marketing ideas, new ideas for what to plant, how to grow your income, whether or not to use chemicals to grow your food, and other types of growing mechanisms. And that's powerful. And I think in our country right now, the more that we can understand and make our urban and rural communities understand how interconnected they are, I think is truly what's going to determine our long-term survival as a nation. The one last thing I want to touch upon before I say goodbye is COVID really highlighted the role of different types of markets, right? So prior to March, every one of our farmers wanted to go to Union Square in Manhattan and Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, our 2 flagship markets. And since March, our community markets, our community-based markets have seen the highest level of growth and profitability for our farmers. And those flagships, those larger hubs, have really seen a reduction. There's been a population shift. People are not commuting. There's no tourism. Restaurants are not operating. And so and people aren't traveling as much. And where they feel safest is not getting on a subway and commuting into Union Square, but going to their neighborhood market in Jackson Heights, in Inwood, in the South, at Poe Park in the South Bronx. And so it's interesting because we now have to relook at our markets, both in the short term and the long term, and new market development and creation. And where do you focus resources? And what happens, and really predict out. So much more to discuss. Good luck to everybody. It's really wonderful to see so many faces, to learn. I've already bought tickets to Tanzania and Vietnam, and Kelly to with the market cities, and to be able to I'm a native Pittsburgher, so anytime I get a chance to read about Pittsburgh, it's a blessing. So thanks, everyone.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing your your insights and in particular shining light on the question of, during this moment of fluid flexibility, where you're correct, restaurants have taken over spaces they never in their wildest dreams could have found the permitting to do so. How much of that activity will remain? How much do we hold on to the gains that informality and urgency have provided us? And also thank you for raising the question of intellectual capital. I know that for many years, those who are driven by dreams of scale would often come to many markets and wonder, well, what's in it for them? Why do they keep coming? The volume of sales isn't that great. And I think that the attention given to measuring some of the more obtuse and obscure elements like intellectual capital is so essential for us to understand what keeps people beneath the tents and umbrellas, is the opportunity to learn, and to learn about each other, to learn about how to improve their businesses, to learn what consumers are looking for, something you don't get to see when you're sort of in a cog in the wheel of wholesale distribution. And therefore, we're beginning to better understand these ancient mechanisms that are proving to be surprisingly agile. Also, looking through the questions in the chat, I'm excited to turn attention to María Huaita Alfaro from Lima, Peru, where she is an urban markets and food and planning expert and a consultant in this space, because María, if you can shed some light on the fact that during the markets, they were not thought of as safe. In fact, one of the main concerns was, and I'm thinking in particular in Quito, that COVID-19 was spreading throughout the market among the vendors. And it raises some of the questions of governance and the voice of the vendors and the associations, whether it is association of vendors, association of markets, how do they have their voice heard in the process when crisis hits? We're so thrilled that you're able to join us from South America, and I give the floor over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. My first thoughts when I heard about the event was that my biggest reflection about this time, the COVID impacts on markets, but also my previous research and those learnings that came along with that research were that, well, the main learnings were that markets were sites of connection. Now seeing all these stories and experiences shared, I see that markets are really connecting different stories in these completely different cities, maybe in the way governance is enacted in each of them. But we share many aspects. I was also following the chat quite actively, with all the questions raised precisely on what you mentioned, Richard, on governance and how certain actors were not really made visible in how cities are everyday made, through everyday operations, and markets in particular in Lima are very, very important sites. We have over 1,000 markets only in Lima. It's almost half the number of markets we have in Peru, of different shapes and sizes and ways of being managed and protected for local governments. But we have mentioned more markets. Maybe also like references were made to certain cities in Brazil and Mexico, where we still have these sites as shaping neighborhoods quite importantly. Well, from what was shared, I wanted to raise 3 reflections connected to governance, but also to other aspects that were visible in the midst of all this problematic. And I don't know if I can share one slide with a few images. Let me try if it works. So yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a big issue to deal with markets, and the government here, the central government and all local governments realized that they were, even if they were trying to enforce restrictions for mobility and other types of social connectedness in the public space, it was very difficult because of the number that I mentioned. And besides, only markets, it's a very, very rough average of 300,000 workers. But if we add informal workers around markets, it's over 1 million. Only in Lima, you can count that number according to WIGO. So it became a very big problem because of the number of people engaged in working at markets, plus the number of people that relied on getting their supplies there. But in the midst of all this problematic, we started seeing expressions of interest from different specialists and organizations that are now, as I mentioned in one of the comments in the chat, are now contributing in providing ideas and also helping with gathering data that we didn't have because we didn't have clear policies for markets. So in a way, it expressed, in my interpretation, the problematic is kind of helping us realize that markets are made of communities, inside but also outside, and we need these different collaborations to learn how to manage them and make them better places because of these important roles that they have for cities. And also it made visible that they remained open because of the centrality of food. And not only these over 1,000 markets remained operating in Lima, but also other markets appeared because the government thought that it was a good idea to have more spaces to decongest markets. But now one of those learnings, those important learnings that I mentioned is that these other street markets are also bringing us new ways of looking at collective spaces for food supply. If before markets were sort of invisibilized and you didn't realize that you have over 1,000 markets in your city, I'm talking about local authorities. Now with these other fairs, you're really realizing like it's visible in streets that food is bringing people in a peaceful way, and it's not so risky, and you can try other ways of recovering markets, maybe connecting them with the idea of public space and also making more visible that their main roles are around food. That was something that, being honest, it was largely missed in Lima and in many other big cities in Peru. And well, finally, my thoughts are that maybe these learnings around the idea of, or the recognition that markets are made of communities, and communities of different actors made them, and the role of food as well made more visible what different transitions can see in the future for markets in cities such as Lima and others that I've heard now in the examples that I think in these comments maybe you will see some things that are similar in these different stories with markets in Africa. What can we see in the future of markets in cities such as ours? No? And this last image is one of the National Federation of Market Traders. That now they have also recognized their role. They are regaining a new visibility and recovered energy to gather more associates all over the country, not only in Lima, and trying from these little efforts, trying to show more about their work and their transitions as well, and their fights for recognition. It was something that was also mentioned in the comments. No? Who are the actors? We're all, at the end, actors around markets, and we all have the chance to relate and connect around them. Thank you.
Ana Maria, thank you so much. And thank you for speaking to something as a slow food person gets to the core of it all, is when you describe that markets are communities. And it's in communities that we can solve problems and dream of the future for markets. We're starting to wind down, but before I hand it over to Remy with UN Habitat, Remy Sechping, to take us home, I would love to be able to turn to our presenters who performed extraordinary restraint and active listening to integrate some of the questions into their presentations. But I suspect that you might, if I can turn to you briefly, if you have any kind of final thoughts or responses to some of the themes that you heard being picked up on by the chat as well as the discussion. I can put one of you on the spot, or if one of you want to step forward, just unmute. Cecilia?
Yeah, no, actually, I was really excited about when you started to talk about governance, actually, and the governance and the legislation. And I think that's absolutely important. And it's often something that we overlook, is that how do we actually govern those spaces? How do we set up those rules and regulations for the use of the space? How do we establish those policies? And I think that's really, the crux of the matter, and what we need to actually support in sort of giving those tools to local governments and other key stakeholders in the market system to be able to develop those strategies, standards, guides, regulations, and similar to be able to manage that. Thank you.
Oh, that's terrific. I mean, I'm reminded of when architects need to study architectural styles, they often go to cemeteries because of the scale of it is so small. You can see all of the different styles in a cemetery. Similarly, in the market, it becomes a place to develop almost as if it's its own city unto itself, the civic peace and the regulations that become the metaphor for how it interacts with the rest of the city and the rest of the region or the national guidelines. I think there's a skill set that I have seen in markets that leaders have a capacity to engage in public policy, but because they don't wear public policy hats, they're not called upon. So that is maybe something that we can really begin to hone the markets as incubators of good public policy. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. A couple of the things that I've seen in the chat especially, which has been remarkably vibrant, and that's really great, is two things. There's been a lot of conversation around the sort of surveying and data collection and how do you do it and how do you get the buy-in. And there's also a conversation, and I just saw another question around this, around the benefits and how do we get people to care, whether it's the population or whether it's the governments themselves. And I actually feel like these two are quite tied. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially since COVID, and I've been thinking about it through the context of the 3 pilot projects that we worked with, the Pittsburgh, Seattle, and Toronto, but also knowing quite well what's going on in New York City as a resident of New York City and having a relationship with GrowNYC and GreenMarket, is that understanding of your benefits and ability to articulate them to the people that need to know what they are. And so where we saw some things kind of break down in terms of cities that were market operators that really thought that they had a very strong relationship with their city, but actually when push came to shove and COVID happened, like the fragility of that relationship really became apparent, versus other cities that kind of were market operators that sprung into action, and the city allowed them to do that and allowed them to in the case of what Michael brought up, like literally expand physically, you know, offer more offerings, practically never close, and continue doing what they're doing. What I see is some of the differences there is that in some cases where market operators were able to keep going, and I'm speaking from a pretty North American perspective here, just to be clear, is where I think that for literally years, if not decades, the articulation of benefits has been really important for market operators to make. And they've been doing it time and time again, and they've been doing it qualitatively and quantitatively. And what has helped in the US in particular with the quantitative side has been the acceptance of federal nutrition assistance programs in markets and the requirement that the government makes them track that data and know how many people they're reaching through SNAP, know how many dollars are being spent, and have that for years now. And have been able to kind of point to it as like, we're not just nice to have, we're actually serving a really important social and economic and public health benefit. Whereas other markets that maybe are kind of newer to collecting that information, or have it but haven't been able to kind of get in the door with the cities to kind of talk about it enough, we're facing more of a situation where a lot of cities were saying, well, you are a special event, you are a nice to have. And I think that need, we've seen, like, now we're in it, right? But it's like we need to have, market operators do need that information, both the qualitative and the quantitative, both are important. And markets often are lacking the capacity to have that quantitative data. And that's why, you know, we realize through, especially through these 3 pilot cities, like just how powerful it can be to have that, but it's not an easy lift. So I don't want to make that kind of suggestion, but I just want to talk about, like, I just wanted to bring up the importance of really understanding the benefits, really putting time into getting those benefits, which is, you know, what we're going to actually talk about in another month or so.
Kelly, thank you for raising the very question about SNAP incentives, which I know is a very North American, US issue of food stamps that can be spent at markets. But it comes back to a question that I think came from Berlin about the elitism of markets and the sort of special amenity rather than an essential service. I think the SNAP incentives, incentivizing behavior change through markets, really shifted the whole narrative about markets in the US, and is a strategy that I think could be deployed elsewhere. I know that we are closing in on time. I see Kristie holding up your finger, and John, you have a look in your face that just like you have a burning question. If you have just quick burning questions, I'll go to both of you. I wanted to go to more people, but Kristie and then John, and then we'll turn over to Remy.
Well, it's not necessarily a burning question, but it is building on what Kelly and Cecilia were talking about. And I do think that the markets are ultimately a political issue. And so one of the things that is really important, in addition to the data, the economic data, in addition to in the countries that we're working in, markets are considered an essential service. So it is not the supermarket. The supermarket is where the elites would go. It is not, it's an opposite picture in Vietnam or in Arusha, for example, in terms of who would go to the markets and not. But really involving the community. And that's what we found was successful in Vietnam in terms of actually reversing the policy where they were going to be closing the markets and then putting up commercial centers and supermarkets. Instead, is that we had the community. We gave the community an opportunity to say why these spaces were so important to them. And so in addition to the quantitative data that we were collecting some of that qualitative information from the older Vietnamese lady who, you know, had her market taken away from her, and now she didn't know where to shop and she didn't want to go in the supermarket. So I think that's really important. And if people have questions for the presenters or for the videos, they're all on this call right now. So feel free to direct a question directly to them and they can answer it in the chat. Thanks.
Camila, do we have time for one more, or should we go to Remy?
No, of course we have time for you.
John.
Great. Very much following on from Kelly, Kristie, and Cecilia. I think that, you know, in a city like Dhaka, which is so dense, it's such a high population, there's so few public spaces. I think markets very much play this, you know, a role within the community that is probably quite different to other cities in the north. And I think that, you know, policymakers, governments need to see this as a way to, you know, bring other benefits other than simply livelihoods and a place to access food. I mean, I love this idea of educating people about nutrition. What we're seeing is this is a place to educate people about COVID safety. And I think there's a lot more of this exchange that can happen in markets that's very positive for neighborhoods, communities at large, that can happen in those spaces. So I think that's something that we will sort of learn from this exchange, and hopefully markets can play an even more outsized role in the positive role to bring benefits to the community.
Captured audience, yes, indeed. And you know, one thing before I hand it over to Remy, there's often this works in the global north, this works in the global south. I think markets are one of these continuums, in part because of the upside down nature of the role of supermarkets, for instance. But the destruction of public markets in the global north, especially in North America, has meant that their reinvention has been so purposeful. And I don't think that every model and program that's been figured out in the US is relevant elsewhere. But the act of the purposeful reinvention is useful because it is a very political project, a low-key one, but a very political project that is, I think, helpful to learn from. Well, we are so excited at Slow Food to be collaborating on this and to be collaborating with UN Habitat. And I think to take us home, I'd love to be able to introduce to Remy, who I know is here. I can't see your face here. I must be on the wrong screen. But Remy, sure if you would like to, there you are. There you are.
Oh,
please,
okay.
The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Really a great opportunity for us to engage on this topic. I won't say it's all about food. And here you have demonstrated that it's not only about food, but also markets and this type of thing. So I was very happy when I heard from Kelly, Kristie, Cecilia, John, on how we all converge in understanding the importance of the multiple functions of a marketplace. You know, it resonates with everyone. And when Michael and Anna now show the experience from the US and Peru, it becomes so vivid that we cannot do without market. And in the end, what I would go home, you know, remembering that we should not be talking about market in singular, but markets. Because I heard a lot about wet market, farmer market, supermarket, public market, informal market, formal market, street markets. So from now on, my vocabulary will be very much about markets because of that multiple ways is understood, but still making sense to all of us. The other thing I felt very strongly, and you articulated very well, is this element of a market as a system. I would say even systems where you have, you know, from the territorial system to the people to actors, they are all connected in a way or the other. The third element I would perhaps recognize is this element of territorial approach that came up strongly, that the market connects territories, connects people, connects functions. And I heard the element of what you call the continuum of markets, which for us resonate a lot when we talk about urban rural linkages. So market is a place, but a place where things are coming from somewhere. So that element of flow resonates there as well. It makes us very much relevant. And we heard a lot about the role of local authorities and communities in working together, how local engineered policies or local policies can make a difference in making sure that the market is that inclusive place that can play multiple functions, multiple roles, and optimize really the resources that are available. I heard a lot, and I agree that market should be that element that glue actors and more inclusive type of space where we will not forget the element of gender, the communities that are there within the market, sub-communities, the issue of rights and responsibilities of actors and those who are engaging in market, the place, the place to socialize, to educate, as we just heard from Dhaka. So they have multiple benefits that you have to acknowledge. But to make that work, we heard a lot about data, knowledge. We have to make sure that the data talks to policymakers, can help us build evidence that policy that could make a difference overall. Another point that I felt was very much important was the issue of governance, the governance of market, the governance and policy and regulations, which as term we are referring to restrictions, which shows that instead of this instrument being the enabler for making market to work, but in quote here, but to really making that place where everyone would like to go, but becomes a restriction. At times just for the issue of safety, security, of livelihood and multiple space. So I think that's something we are also taking home. And last thing that I didn't hear much, but I felt we need to reflect on moving forward, the virtual digital market in this time of COVID, in this time of digital transition. What does it mean when we now talk about markets? What does it mean when we go online, where most of the things are now online? So I will stop here, Richard. Great conversation. I go home very happy person. All right, over to you.
Remy, thank you so much. And thank you so much for collaborating with us and allowing this conversation to be part of the Terra Madre Worldwide. I hope that everyone has connected with new partners and allies, and we can keep the conversation moving forward. Of course, this is being recorded and will be posted on I think, both the UN Habitat website as well as the Slow Food Terra Madre one. Thank you to all of the presenters for being so purposeful and disciplined. They were extraordinary, and thank you for bringing in the world of markets beneath one canopy this morning, this afternoon, and this evening.